Hello, everybody. It's time for our ninth forum. Today, we're going to be looking at the American Jewish experience from founding to World War I. The United States and the colonies before it being an extension of West European, primarily of West European history. I would say that in the vast literature of Jewish history, there has been a problem in integrating the American story into the broader Jewish story, and historians are still struggling with that. I think if you were to appraise from a structural point of view our textbook, which has so many virtues, the American story is not particularly well integrated into it, although for the second half of the 20th century, the United States has been the host of the largest Jewish community in the history of the Jewish people. You could probably argue that it has been the most secure Jewish community in Jewish history, and certainly the most affluent. American Jews have literally done amazing things. But how to integrate that story into the larger Jewish story has proven to be problematic. And also it's true in an American context that little of American Jewish history is reported in the broader context of American history. You could argue, of course, that the Jews are just a tiny group of people in America, even though it's a big Jewish community by Jewish standards. By American standards, with 330 million people in the society now and about 5.5 million Jews, we're just not that big. Or if you push it back to the time of the Civil War, that there were about 30 million people in America, both slave and free. And of that population, 150,000 or so were Jewish. So they were small, but there's an expression, small but tall. The Jews have been very influential because of their contributions, but even more than that, they often provided the case which breaks the rule. How can America be a society which respects freedom of religion and in which 98% of the people a given year are Christian? So how do you include non-Christians? How how could America view itself as being pro-religious but not secular on the one hand, and not anti-Semitic or something like that on the other hand? So there are all types of challenges here of trying to place American Jewish history. Now, from the very beginning, when there was Jewish settlement in North America in 1654, probably the summer of 1654, with individuals coming and then the group, the famous group that came to Manhattan in September of 1654, I think it's fair to say that there were assumptions on the ground in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and in North America about both Jews and Judaism long before there were Jews here and Judaism being practiced in the Western Hemisphere broadly. And much of it, of course, was negative. In all of the Iberian colonies, you had the Inquisition, so obviously neither Jews nor Judaism could flourish there. France, at different points, had really prohibited Jewish settlement in their colonies in the New World, and furthermore had a certain colonial philosophy which was not oriented toward building infrastructure so that there wouldn't be many cities, and therefore not really hospitable to Jews who were not interested as much as living on the frontier, which primarily leaves, of course, the Dutch and the English, and that is where you find Jewish settlement, first among the Dutch and then among the English. The Dutch, of course, have the colony of New Amsterdam in 1654, That's when Jews arrived there. And in 1664, the colony is handed over to the English. You'll have to excuse me. I will need a couple sips here and there today. I'm kind of hoarse. They handed over to the English without a fight, probably a reasonably good decision. Why have the whole city burned down? And from that point forward, American Jews are within the orbit of the English Empire, which does incentivize Jewish settlement in colonies and trying to help control population inside of England itself. Really, only a handful come here. You have 2,500 Jews total or so by the time of the American Revolution. They are distributed in several cities from the south, Savannah, and then Charleston, then Philadelphia, New York, and Newport, Rhode Island. They're all colonial period communities. The push to the west is very, very slow and limited during this time. In the different colonies, the Jews have different levels of rights. So, for example, New England, with the exception of Rhode Island, was inhospitable to Jews, and even Rhode Island had its problems. The wealthiest Jew of the colony was a man by the name of Aaron Lopez, and yet he was unable to naturalize in Rhode Island. He had to go to Massachusetts, which largely was inhospitable to Jews with their Puritan ideology. New York was about as open as any city. I would put Charleston in the same category. The communities organized themselves around the Sephardi minhag in terms of practice. It was Iberian until 1795, when an Ashkenazic Rite synagogue is established here in Philadelphia, RS. It's an Orthodox synagogue that will later go Reform about 100 years after its establishment. The Jews had various rights. New York had Jewish sheriffs and magistrates and things of that nature, but Judaism was not a state religion. It was not established, as was the Church of England or other churches. So it took the American Revolution to redefine the situation, and I would say with the Revolution and with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you get the first, and if not the first, the second after France, country in which Jews are fully emancipated and can be citizens and can serve in the army and all the other aspects of citizenship. There was a debate here in the United States. It was not as aggravated a debate as it was in Europe, but nevertheless there were questions about whether or not Jews could be fully enfranchised. The longest holdout from the colonial period was New Hampshire, which did not fully allow Jews in office until the 1870s. The American Jewish community remained very small until the end of the War of 1812, at which point there were a number of significant changes. First of all, the British were no longer attacking boats in the North Atlantic, so you had security. Second, you had a change in transportation technology with the introduction of steam. When one is sailing with just wind, it takes approximately 3 months to cross the ocean, which means you can do one round trip a year. And it's a short year because you can't travel when the weather is bad. It's dangerous. With steam, the crossing was reduced to 3 weeks, so 6 weeks. And the time of the transportation was elongated from 6 months to 9 months. So it became much more possible for Jews to come here. And between the end of War of 1812 and the Civil War, the community does grow more than tenfold. You also had a growing economy here in the United States that needed, quote, Europeans to work that colony. And you had economic dislocations and political dislocations, as we have seen, in Central Europe after the Congress of Vienna, a period of reaction, Romanticism, which tends to be exclusive of Jews, sets in. So the storm, the perfect storm, configures itself, and you get an increase of Jews coming here to the United States. They settle mostly in towns and cities. They build up the cities on the East Coast. They create Jewish communities in the interior of the country, cities like Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis, very heavily German, and on the West Coast, beginning with San Francisco because of the gold rush. Jews are largely tied into the clothing industry. And as a result of that, I would say the scale tipped in favor of pro-South, pro-slavery viewpoint up until the war itself, and then the dynamics, of course, change rather radically. In terms of the religious life of the American Jewish community, the vast majority of German Jews who came here during this period were traditional. Might not have been strictly Orthodox, might not have been yeshiva trained, but the Judaism that they knew in Germany was decidedly of a traditional stripe. I really don't think reform grows very much until after the Civil War, when you get a second generation born here in the States of German Jews, and more rabbinic leadership coming in from Germany, and the spiritualizing effects of the American Civil War. Jews were on both sides of the Civil War, more numerous in the South, but the Northern Jews were split politically between the basically pro-South Democrats and the Republicans. The South was solid for the Confederacy, and the West, with a smaller Jewish population, was split. If you add up all the pieces, even split in the North and a solid South, I would say the scales tip in favor of states' rights, the Confederacy, and slavery. It's something we can debate in the threads. The argument basically was the Torah is supportive of slavery, that when they go to Mount Sinai and the legislation is given about Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, the slave is entitled to Sabbath rest. In other words, it assumes that Israelites, ancient Jews, will have slaves. And then even more remarkable is that after the giving of the Ten Commandments in Parshat Yitro, in the next section of the Torah, Parshat Mishpatim, on laws, it begins with a discussion of slavery, albeit indentured Hebrew slavery, but the assumption is that slavery is somehow a normal, regulated institution within society. The majority of American Jews probably agreed with that, and a small minority, a vocal minority at that, was abolitionist and said that it was repulsive, that all men are created in the image of God, all people are created in the image of God, and that there is a difference between biblical intent and biblical practice, that what you saw in Bible days was an accommodation and not the deeper principle. Rabbi David Einhorn, who was the leading abolitionist, used to quote the text that if you see an ox that has collapsed under its burden, that you remove the burden and help the ox up. All the more so, he would argue, in the case of human beings. If they are collapsing under their work, that is, their slaves, then you must take the task away from them and help them back up on their feet. On the southern side, they tended to take a more literalist view of the Bible and cited the various biblical passages on slavery, as well as the ethnography of the sons of Noah, to try and justify why there was black slavery and not other forms of slavery here in the United States. Now, after the Civil War, contrary, I think, to most opinion, I hold the view that anti-Semitism intensified in the United States, that it was a byproduct of the Jim Crow that set in after slavery was destroyed. Then Jim Crow legislation came in, ultimately formulated itself through the Supreme Court in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision of separate but equal. What we know is that separate but equal never works. It's always separate and not equal. And that was the case here in the States. It's also true that this impulse to separate and rank people by worth in society spread beyond attitudes between white and black, but also to the Jewish community, which began to see restrictive covenants and other problems. That being said, the German Jews continued to prosper, and by the mid-1870s were beginning to build impressive national organizations. They were ultimately challenged by a new demographic of Jews coming in ever-increasing numbers from Eastern Europe, a development which was sparked by the pogroms after Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and the Tsarist government turned up the heat when the Jewish community began to get a building stream of Jewish immigrants here, peaking after 1905 up to the time of World War I. That immigration again multiplies the Jewish community 20-some times, and by the eve of World War I, the only Jewish community really that is bigger than the United States is inside of Tsarist Russia, and Europe retains that distinction after World War I with the creation of Poland. Poland had more Jews than the United States, and then because of the Holocaust and increase here, the United States, up until very recently, had the largest Jewish community in the world. The American Jewish experience, in my opinion, was greatly transformed early in the 20th century by the progressive movement, which was attractive to American Jews. The majority of them had come from Russia, had heard and listened to socialist arguments, trade union arguments. By the way, they're not the same. Socialists tend to see the unions as being bourgeois and middle class, and not really trying to promote revolution or centralized economy, but rather just trying to help the workers out and get ahead and get them out of the blue collar and into the white collar. The Russian Jews tended away from the right and towards the middle in the left, although the full conversion, or not the full, but the overwhelming majority go to the Democratic camp. There are changes in that camp in 28 with the Al Smith versus Hoover contest for the presidency in 1928. Progressive politics in America introduce or institutionalize this idea of progress in general. Things are supposed to get better, that it's a destiny. You hear that all the time in American politics today, that there is a teleos to history, and that it's an upward arch, and that things are supposed to get better. World War I was a real big challenge to that, and caused many Christians to rethink their position. Part of this great self-improvement of society was social justice, and an expansion of what perhaps the social contract might have immediately meant back in the days of first Locke and Rousseau, but thereafter Jefferson, Madison, and the others, that we really need to join forces to take care of one another. Today that would probably be referred to as entitlements or something along those lines, and a matter of great of dispute. Progressives had a vision of an enlarged state that had social responsibilities. It is a viewpoint that was not really fully translated in the 20s, but was so once the Depression came along, and progressivism became the basis for New Deal philosophy, which American Jews greatly resonated toward. In the early 20th century, you also get a clear relocation of traditional forces in American Judaism. Once the Reform movement is defined, and mostly on rather radicalized lines, The traditionalists will begin to set up institutions which, when fully developed and combined, become yeshiva university, and also reorganizing themselves and strengthening themselves was the now conservative movement, which had been called positive historical in Europe. You had the reform movement itself, and then you also had kind of a rejectionist orthodoxy that said that the group that was building Yeshiva University was to assimilate it. They used English instead of Yiddish, and we need to create an infrastructure for traditional European rabbis. During the time of great migration here, one of the great Rabbanim of East Europe, Isaac Elchanan Spector, after whom the rabbinic school is named at YU, issued an opinion basically that said that America is bad for Jews. Bad for Judaism, but good for the Jews. Bad for Judaism, but good for the Jews. He argued that if Jews came to America, that it would relieve them of persecution and probably would lead to greater financial stability, if not to wealth. So for the Jews and the Jewish body, America was good. But he also argued that his followers should not settle in America because America was bad for Judaism. And that, he argued, if you come to America and settle, your grandchildren will marry Gentiles. Therefore, you should not move here. Kind of the same argument that we heard from the original Lubavitcher Rebbe about the impact Napoleon was going to have on the Jewish community. So that kind of is the final question here. Here we see this vast transformation from a tiny handful of 2,500 Jews in 1776 to 2.5 million Jews at the time of the Revolution, from America being a distant satellite in the Jewish community to being the largest Jewish community, the second largest Jewish community in the world, with a broad galaxy, a broad scope of different Jewish persuasions. With all that, has America been good for Judaism? I think we can agree that it has been good for Jews, but from a cultural, religious point of view, has it been good for Judaism? So we're going to be reading. I'll make sure the correct page numbers are up, both in Hallow as well as in the Mendes Floor reader. And I do look forward to reading all of your many threads in the week ahead on the Jews and America. Take care and see you online.